A Tudor mother could die for giving birth to the wrong child. Behind every cradle was a secret no chronicle dared to name. And behind every smile was a price someone else would pay. The court praised mothers, then erased them. It protected princes. Then hid them. It welcomed life. Then traded it like currency. Tonight, don't we step into the quiet rooms where these stories were never meant to survive? So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment, letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand in a Tudor palace corridor and watch the way people shifted their gaze whenever a woman carried a newborn son, it would become clear how fragile her position truly was. The presence of a male infant did not soften the air around her. Instead, it tightened it. A son meant possibility, but it also meant scrutiny. Courtiers lingered longer near her chambers, listening for small sounds, searching for small signs, noting every visit, every whisper, every hesitation in her steps. The birth of a boy expanded her world in name only. In truth, it narrowed the path beneath her feet. The child, still unable to lift his head, already carried a weight he could not understand. His existence rearranged the quiet balance of the palace. Servants became cautious. Advisors adjusted their tone. Women in the Queen's household watched with a stillness that felt colder than silence. A son brought potential change, and change was rarely welcome in a place that protected its own hierarchy with an iron calm. The mother learned quickly that pride had to be hidden. Even simple joy drew attention she could not afford. Inside her chamber, the air smelled of linens and cooling herbs. A midwife folded cloths into a neat stack, making sure her hands trembled as little as possible. The newborn slept without awareness of the tension that filled the room. The mother, exhausted, kept her expression even. She had already understood that softness could be mistaken for ambition. The walls seemed close around her, and though the candlelight flickered gently, nothing felt warm. She held the child carefully, as if the pressure of her own fingers could betray her intentions. Outside, the Queen's attendants moved with controlled steps. They carried messages, but none said plainly what they feared. If the Queen had no living son, another woman's newborn placed her under a cold shadow. And shadows, in Tudor courts, often led to consequences. The mother knew this, even before childbirth. She had sensed the shift in voices when her pregnancy began to show. She saw the measured distance others kept. She understood the calculation behind every polite greeting. Now that the child existed, those calculations sharpened. Some women prayed quietly that the infant would grow strong. There were others who prayed for the opposite. In this palace, hope and fear often shared the same breath. No one spoke openly. Words moved like threads pulled through cloth, tightening or loosening, depending on who held the needle. The mother of a son was not protected by her accomplishment. She was exposed to it. Nights brought little peace. The mother lay still, listening to the faint crack of wood as the building settled, to footsteps passing in the corridor, to the restless breathing of the newborn in the cradle. She kept her eyes open long after the candles had burned low. Any unexpected sound made her chest tighten. The palace was not a place where danger arrived with warning. It arrived quietly, wearing soft shoes. The child's small cries echoed differently from those of other infants. They carried an implication that unsettled the servants. Some responded quickly, wanting to show loyalty. Others hesitated, careful not to appear too devoted. The mother observed all of this without comment. She was learning who might stand near her in the months ahead, and who would step aside the moment risk appeared. There were moments of stillness when she watched the boy sleep. his fingers curled lightly, his breath shallow and steady. In those moments, he looked harmless, untouched by the world that already judged him. But innocence had little value here. Every future possibility rested on his body. Even illness, common and unpredictable, could shift political currents. A fever might strengthen one faction and weaken another. A cough might alter someone's rise or fall. The fragility of the child amplified the fragility of everyone around him. When visitors came to pay their respects, their eyes lingered too long. Some smiled with courtesy that did not reach their gaze. Some offered blessings spoken with rigid lips. The mother remained careful in every gesture, keeping her voice low, her movements measured. She understood that the tone she used, the way she held the child, even the length of her silence, could be interpreted as a declaration. Misinterpretation could be a wound that never healed. Even the air of the palace shifted. Rumors drifted from room to room like thin smoke. The Queen's household tightened its ranks. Advisors retreated into private discussions. Officials walked with quicker steps. The mother felt each change like pressure against her ribs. The child slept, unaware of what he represented. His existence was a future no one wanted to name out loud. At times, the mother pressed her hand lightly against the wooden cradle, steadying herself more than the child. She did not think of triumph. She did not think of a reward. She thought only of survival, of what was required to move quietly through days that no longer belonged to her. The palace had taken hold of her life in a way she could not undo. And the boy, small, warm, and unaware, was the reason. Everything here shows how quickly a single birth could unsettle the calm that people tried to pretend existed. Yet beneath this fragile order, a deeper struggle is already gathering around her without a sound. And within that gathering lies a truth she will have to face long before anyone speaks it aloud. A newborn boy in the Tudor court altered the rhythm of the palace long before he learned to speak. His presence marked a shift that reached every corner of the household. People who once passed his mother without notice now adjusted their posture when approaching her. The change was subtle, but it carried weight. A son meant that she touched the edge of power, even if that power did not belong to her. It was a fragile position, sharpened by the knowledge that every move she made was observed. The boy was barely days old when advisors began to speak of him in restrained tones. They measured their words carefully, as though the future might be listening. The child's body was small, but the meaning placed upon it was not. His name would travel through discussions he would never hear. His life, still so quiet, already shaped the ambitions of those around him. To his mother, this attention never felt like protection. It felt like a boundary narrowing around her. Within her chamber, the routines changed quickly. Servants arranged objects with greater precision. Midwives lowered their voices. Even candles were positioned so that shadows fell cleanly across the cradle, as if someone might study the room for signs of disorder. The mother understood that any sign of carelessness could be used against her. The court did not forgive mistakes, especially from women who had something others wanted to control. Although the king offered her more frequent visits, his affection did not bring safety. His presence only intensified the burden she carried. Every gesture of warmth from him exposed her to deeper scrutiny from those who feared how her influence might grow. She responded with quiet courtesy, keeping her expression composed, her hands still. No one in the palace respected a woman who appeared too confident. Yet no one trusted a woman who appeared afraid. Balance became a necessity she could not neglect. The child, meanwhile, lay wrapped in cloth embroidered with symbols meant to protect him, though those symbols held no power against the people who watched him. To the court, he was no longer simply a child. He was a point of leverage, a reminder of political vulnerabilities. A symbol reshaped each time he drew breath. His cries travelled through the corridors, and every ear interpreted them differently, some with hope, others with unease. As the days passed, the quiet competition around him became clearer. Advisors visited more often, using polite conversation to gauge the mother's temperament. Some offered guidance disguised as kindness. Others delivered warnings cloaked in courtesy. She learned to answer with the smallest number of words possible. Silence protected her more effectively than any alliance she could form. In the Queen's household, the atmosphere stiffened. Some attendants walked past her with lowered eyes. Others paused longer than necessary, their gazes steady but unreadable. Her child's existence threatened the structure they served, and they did not hide their unease. She felt their distance grow, not through spoken hostility, but through the absence of simple gestures. Fewer nods, fewer greetings, fewer signs that she belonged in these halls at all. The palace itself responded to the presence of the boy. Footsteps outside her chamber became more deliberate. Conversations quieted when she drew near. The air carried a sense of waiting. As if the court stood on the edge of a shift no one wished to name openly. The boy breathed softly in his cradle, unaware that his life was already a negotiation. Sometimes, when the corridor fell still, she placed her hand lightly on the wooden frame of the cradle and tried to steady her thoughts. She reminded herself that her son was living proof of her connection to the king, but also the reason she could not trust anyone completely. This truth settled over her with a weight stronger than fear. She did not dare show hesitation. In Tudor Courts, hesitation was treated as guilt. The boy slept with his small fists curled near his chest, untouched by the tension he created. Yet every hour that passed deepened the political meaning carved around him. His mother saw it in the measured steps of the guards, in the silence of the attendants, in the way the king's advisors studied her face when she spoke. The child was no longer only hers. He belonged to the palace, to its plans, to its dangers. Everything unfolding here reveals how a single infant could tilt the balance of a household without uttering a word. Yet beneath this fragile calm, a quieter threat is already forming around her daily life. And within that threat lies a consequence she will not be able to turn away from. Pregnancy in the Tudor court unfolded under a stillness that did not resemble safety. Each month carried its own uncertainty, and every small change in the mother's body drew more attention than she wished for. There were no reliable methods of care, no consistent guidance, and no assurance that the process would end with both mother and child alive. The court behaved as though childbirth were a natural duty, yet no one dismissed the quiet fear that accompanied it. Women understood that survival was never guaranteed. The corridors outside her chamber grew heavier as her pregnancy advanced. Servants walked with muted steps, their eyes drifting toward her abdomen with guarded curiosity. Some carried concern, others suspicion, and none offered reassurance. Her world shrank into a sequence of restrained movements. Slow steps, careful breaths, long hours in bed when the air felt too heavy. She learned to steady herself without drawing attention. Even discomfort could be taken as a sign of weakness. Physicians visited with a seriousness that did not comfort her. Their hands moved over bowls of herbs and coarse cloths, and their explanations were vague, wrapped in formality rather than knowledge. They observed her complexion, her pulse, the way she inhaled, yet their conclusions rarely changed anything. Remedies were limited to what tradition allowed, and tradition often failed. She listened quietly to their instructions, knowing they could not guarantee her survival. The midwives, though more familiar with childbirth, brought their own unease. They had seen too many women falter during the final hours. Some whispered prayers under their breath while preparing clothes. Others kept their expressions blank, as though detachment protected them from the outcomes they could not control. The mother watched their movements closely, sensing in their gestures the quiet truth that childbirth was closer to a gamble than a celebration. Outside her windows, the palace functioned as usual. Footsteps, murmured conversations, and the muted clatter of daily work continued without pause. None of it softened the isolation that settled over her. Pregnancy separated her from the rest of the court, placing her in a space where risk shaped every moment. Even the king's visits brought only brief comfort. He spoke with confidence, but confidence did not change the unpredictability of childbirth, and she recognized the distance in his voice. He cared about the outcome, not the suffering that led to it. The nights felt longest. She lay awake, listening to the faint creak of beams, the shift of fabric, the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Each movement of the child reminded her that they were both suspended in a process that neither could control. Pain visited her in waves, sometimes mild, sometimes sharp, and each time it came, she waited for it to fade, unsure whether it signaled danger. Shadows on the walls lengthened and curled, forming shapes that seemed to press in around her bed. As her body changed, the court's interest changed with it. Advisors began discussing possible futures tied to the unborn child. Servants whispered about signs they believed indicated a boy or a girl. Some congratulated her prematurely, while others avoided her entirely. She understood the meaning behind their caution. A successful pregnancy could strengthen her position, but failure could erase it instantly. The court had no patience for grief. Loss was acknowledged with formal words and then forgotten. Her breaths grew shorter as the final weeks approached. Midwives returned more frequently, examining her with practiced hands. They checked the temperature of the room, rearranged linens, and asked questions to which she could offer only vague responses. Pain circled her in unpredictable intervals. She endured it silently, aware that any display of fear might unsettle those around her. The palace expected composure even in moments when survival felt uncertain. She often placed her hand over her abdomen and counted the movements beneath her palm. Some nights, the child was restless, shifting as though searching for space. Other nights brought quiet stillness that made her throat tighten. The uncertainty pulled at her, but she learned not to voice her concerns. In Tudor courts, fear was not a private emotion. Once spoken, it became a tool others could use. When the time finally came, the chamber filled with hurried preparation. Candles were lit, cloths boiled, and chairs repositioned. Voices dropped to low instructions. The mother breathed in shallow bursts as pain tightened around her. Sweat gathered along her hairline, and her fingers curled into the fabric beneath her. The midwives moved quickly, but haste did not mean mastery. They knew the limits of their knowledge, and so did she. The hours stretched without mercy. Her vision blurred and sharpened in uneven intervals. The sound of her own breath seemed unfamiliar. She could sense the tension in the room, the way every attendant waited for signs that the birth might turn toward disaster. Some women never rose from this bed again. Others survived only to lose the child. The possibility of joy was always held beside the possibility of death. When the newborn finally entered the world, the silence was broken with a thin cry. Relief passed through the room, though it did not erase the exhaustion pressing against her limbs. She closed her eyes briefly, knowing this moment carried no promise. Infants could slip away within days. Mothers often weakened beyond recovery. She felt the weight of the uncertainty that remained. Her body trembled as attendants worked around her. The child was examined, wrapped, and shown to her only briefly. Her breath steadied, but her thoughts lingered on the fragility of their survival. She had reached the end of one danger, only to face another. Everything here shows how childbirth in this world is balanced delicately between life and loss. Yet beyond this night, a different pressure will begin to settle around her without pause. Something waits inside that pressure, a truth she will be forced to face even if she tries to remain unseen. A woman who bore the king's son without holding a title understood very quickly that the palace never intended to protect her. Her position was built on silence, not legitimacy. and every breath she took inside those halls reminded her of it. The birth of a boy did not soften the court's judgment, it hardened it. People watched her movements with a quiet suspicion, as if she carried something that might shift the foundation beneath their feet. To them, she was not a mother. She was a threat with a heartbeat. Servants approached her differently once the child existed. They kept their eyes lowered too long, or avoided looking at her at all. Courtesy became mechanical, stripped of warmth. No one offered reassurance. They knew the rules far better than she did. Women without titles were expected to remain invisible. Any sign of confidence could be misinterpreted as ambition. And ambition in the hands of a woman the king favoured was treated as a danger that needed to be contained. Her chambers were modest compared to those of noble women. But even modest rooms echoed with risk. Each knock at the door made her tense. Messages arrived without explanation, and attendants entered with rehearsed expressions. Some delivered instructions from higher officials. Others came under the pretense of assistance, but spent more time observing her than helping. The walls were thin, and she often heard her own name spoken in tones too low to decipher. It was not affection, she heard. It was a calculation. She held her child with steady arms, careful not to reveal how heavily the uncertainty pressed on her. The infant's small breaths warmed her skin. Yet the warmth did nothing to quiet her fear. In the eyes of the court, this boy could disrupt lines of inheritance, sway alliances, or weaken the queen's position. Every possibility made the mother more vulnerable. The child was considered valuable. But she was not. Her bond with him could be severed at any moment if those in power believed it served their needs. The queen's household carried itself with a brittle calm around her. They observed her with measured indifference, offering no visible hostility, but no kindness either. Their restraint was sharp enough to wound. She sensed in their behavior a warning. Her presence should be temporary, her attachment controlled. Even the gentlest gestures toward her son earned brief, cold glances. She learned to lower her eyes, to say little, to move with the quietness expected of someone who knew her place. Rumours travelled faster than footsteps in the palace. Some claimed the king's affection for her had grown too visible. Others whispered that the child resembled him more than was comfortable for the queen. None of these whispers could be traced, yet all of them strengthened the fear surrounding her. She became the subject of conversations she was never meant to hear. Her life no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the narratives others constructed. Pressure thickened around her as officials visited her chambers with polite but firm instructions. They spoke gently while telling her what she was not allowed to do. She must not be seen too often carrying the child, must not ask questions about the future, must not speak to the wrong attendants. Their words were framed as concern for her well-being. But the message beneath was unmistakable. She was being managed, not protected. Every decision concerning her child rested in the hands of people she had never met before. There were days when she feared that the cradle beside her bed would disappear by morning. It happened quietly to other women, whispered about in corners of the palace. A royal order could relocate an infant without ceremony. A mother could be told that the boy needed more skilled caretakers, or that his upbringing required a location more appropriate for his status. The palace expected her to accept such decisions without protest. Resistance from a woman without rank was treated as disobedience. Nights offered no relief. She lay awake, listening for footsteps that might stop at her door. Her mind replayed stories of women who had been escorted away under the guise of reassignment, never again seeing the children they had risked their lives to bring into the world. She wondered whether the same fate awaited her. Her breath remained shallow. Her hands clasped tightly together, as though holding them steady might keep her future from shifting. The child slept peacefully beside her, unaware that forces beyond his comprehension were already shaping his fate. She leaned over the cradle, studying the softness of his features, knowing how quickly the court could turn this quiet moment into something she would lose. The boy's existence marked her as both important and disposable. Power reached for him, but danger reached for her. Every passing day pulled the mother deeper into a tension she could not escape. She learned to measure her words and to hide her fears behind a still expression. The palace expected her to behave as though her son belonged to the king alone. It was expected of her to understand that affection was a liability. Yet, in the early morning hours, when the corridors fell silent and candlelight dimmed, the truth pressed hardest against her. The palace wanted the child, not the woman who carried him into the world. Everything unfolding here shows how easily her life can be reshaped by forces she cannot resist. Yet behind this fragile calm, decisions are already being prepared without her knowledge. A quiet consequence waits within those decisions, pressing closer than she is ready to admit. The Queen's presence cast a long shadow across the palace, and for a woman who had given the king a son, that shadow felt colder with each passing day. The Queen carried herself with restraint, yet the tension surrounding her deepened whenever the infant was mentioned. Her inability to produce a surviving male heir weighed heavily on her, and the existence of another woman's son sharpened that burden into something sharper than disappointment. Court life had taught her to maintain dignity, but even dignity could not hide the bitterness that settled behind her eyes. The mother of the boy sensed this shift early. Servants, who once greeted her with polite indifference, now kept their distance when members of the Queen's household were nearby. Conversations ended abruptly as she approached. She noticed how hands stiffened before offering her anything, how footsteps paused outside her door, as if waiting for permission before entering. These were not accidents. The Queen's influence shaped the atmosphere, and the court responded accordingly. Political factions observed the situation with a watchfulness that bordered on hunger. They had long struggled for favour, for proximity to the throne, for control of decisions whispered behind closed doors. The birth of a son outside the Queen's chambers provided them with a new excuse to manoeuvre. Some positioned themselves closer to the Queen, offering comfort that masked their ambitions. Others drifted toward the king, feigning concern for the stability of succession. None cared about the mother who lived quietly in her rooms, though her presence became the spark they needed. Her days grew increasingly narrow. Attendants assigned to her shifted regularly, as though the palace did not want her forming attachments. The Queen's ladies passed her with measured expressions, their glances steady and unblinking. They arranged their gowns with deliberate precision, as though ensuring the world understood who held legitimate authority. The mother kept her head lowered, knowing that any hint of defiance could be recorded and passed upward like a warning. Within the council chambers, her child's name entered discussions she was never meant to hear. Advisors debated the proper boundaries of his upbringing, questioning whether the boy should remain near his mother at all. Some argued it would be safer for him to be raised by loyal households aligned with the Queen. Others insisted that removing him too quickly would invite rumours of cruelty. These arguments were not about her. They were about optics, power, and appearances the court wished to maintain. The Queen herself remained silent in public, but silence in the Tudor court carried more weight than accusation. Her restrained manner suggested she would not act impulsively. Yet everyone knew she had the authority to order changes that would reshape the mother's life completely. The Queen's subtle gestures, an extended pause, a quiet nod, a single raised brow, were enough to alter the behaviour of entire groups. The mother felt these gestures, even when she did not witness them directly. Meanwhile, political factions watched her child with an unsettling interest. To some, he represented a tool to weaken the Queen's influence. To others, he represented a danger that must be contained before it grows. They did not view him as a fragile infant, but as a symbol with the potential to disrupt alliances carefully built over years. Their ambitions wrapped themselves around him, tightening with each passing week. The mother began noticing unfamiliar individuals lingering near her chambers. Some arrived, claiming to offer assistance, though their eyes lingered on the cradle more than on her. Others passed through the corridors too slowly, as if measuring the distance between her rooms and the Queen's wing. She learned not to question their presence. Questions drew suspicion, and suspicion drew consequences. At night, the palace felt tense, held together only by the thickness of the walls. Candlelight flickered down the hall, casting long shadows that moved even when no one passed. The mother slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound. Her thoughts circled the same fear. The boy's existence was reshaping the palace, and she had no control over the direction it took. The queen's bitterness, the faction's ambitions, the king's unpredictable affection, each created currents that pulled her deeper into uncertainty. The child slept without awareness of the weight placed upon him. His breath rose and fell in soft rhythms. Untouched by the politics forming around him, the mother watched him, knowing that even his smallest whimper might be interpreted through the lens of fear or ambition. He was a reason for celebration only in theory. In practice, he was a catalyst for conflict. Every moment reminded her that she lived on ground that could shift without warning. A single decision from the queen could isolate her. A single rumor could destroy her standing. A single whisper in the wrong chamber could turn the palace against her entirely. These dangers pressed in from all sides, forming a quiet pressure she carried with every step. Everything unfolding here reveals how her world tightens with each glance and whispered judgment. Yet beneath this surface tension, the conflict surrounding her child is beginning to sharpen into something more direct. One quiet turn in that conflict is drawing near, carrying consequences she cannot avoid. The child's presence alone altered the stillness of the palace. He could not speak. He could not understand the world around him. Yet his existence unsettled people with a quiet force that no words could match. Courtiers, who once walked through the corridors without hesitation, now lowered their voices when passing his chamber. Their steps softened, not out of respect, but out of caution. A single glance at the cradle reminded them that the boy represented a future they did not wish to imagine. For those whose status depended on the queen, the child was a silent threat. He breathed, and their positions trembled. His small fingers curled and uncurled, and whispers spread in the background like dry leaves shifting in the wind. They did not have to speak openly to reveal their unease. It showed in the stiffness of their posture, in the controlled expressions they wore when they caught sight of him, in the way their hands paused mid-gesture before resuming with studied calm. His mother noticed each detail, though she kept her own face still. The boy's smile unsettled the palace more than his cries. When he smiled, briefly, faintly, without understanding, those aligned against his mother felt their chests tighten. It was not joy they sensed. It was danger disguised as innocence. They saw in that moment a possibility they feared. Affection might grow, bonds might strengthen, and the king's attention might shift in ways they could not influence. A harmless expression became a reason for tightened alliances and quiet planning. His cries carried a different weight. When he cried, attendants listened too intently. They seemed to measure the sound, searching for meaning far beyond what an infant could intend. Some interpreted it as a weakness. Others feared it would draw sympathy from the king. The mother lifted him with calm hands, aware that every sound he made could be twisted into a sign of something she never meant to suggest. She learned to soothe him quickly, not only for his sake, but for her own protection. Inside her chamber, the air shifted with unspoken tension. Items were arranged and rearranged by servants who did not hide their discomfort. They avoided touching the cradle unless necessary, as if the wood itself carried risk. The mother felt eyes moving across her, assessing every gesture. Each time she held the child, she sensed the subtle surveillance that wrapped around both of them. Nothing she did remained unnoticed. Rumors moved through the palace with increasing ease. Some claimed the child resembled the king too closely. Others insisted he did not resemble him enough. Both versions served different agendas, and neither served her. She remained silent when the whispers reached her, understanding that reacting would only deepen the danger. In the Tudor court, silence was the only defense that could not be misquoted. There were moments when the mother watched her son sleep and wondered how someone so small could cast such a wide shadow. His breaths were soft, his movements faint, yet the fear surrounding him grew each day. He belonged to the king, but he also belonged to the palace's imagination, reshaped, magnified, and weaponized by those who saw opportunity in his existence. His mother knew she could not protect him from that imagination. She could only delay its consequences. Tension sharpened whenever he was brought briefly into larger rooms. People straightened, some stepping back, others leaning in as though trying to read the future in the movement of an infant's limbs. The Queen's ladies maintained polite expressions, but their eyes betrayed unease. A child who had done nothing was already caught in a competition he could not comprehend. The mother carried him with deliberate calm, aware that any sign of pride or fear would be interpreted as intention. As the boy grew more alert, the palace grew more anxious. He followed movement with his eyes, reached for objects, and responded to voices. Each developmental step brought with it a deeper tension. Advisors debated quietly whether he should begin early training, whether he should be relocated, and whether remaining near his mother placed him too close to influence. None considered the emotional cost. They thought only of political consequences. The mother sensed the approaching danger before anyone said it aloud. Her instincts sharpened, shaped by weeks of watching the palace react to her child with increasing rigidity. The air around her felt thinner. People who once offered small courtesies now withheld them. Even the guards stationed near her chambers seemed to watch her with a different expression, one that suggested decisions had already begun forming far beyond her reach. She pressed her hand lightly against the side of the cradle, steadying both herself and the wooden frame. The child stirred, unaware of the forces gathering outside the room. His small cry echoed through the chamber, soft but clear. She lifted him gently, holding him close. In that moment, she understood the truth more sharply than ever. He was not resented for what he had done, but for what he might someday become. Her world had already narrowed. Now, it was beginning to close. Everything unfolding here shows how a single infant can unsettle the powerful without ever speaking a word. Yet as this unease grows sharper, those who fear him are preparing their next move in silence. A quiet turn within that silence is approaching, carrying a consequence she will not be able to turn aside. Recognition tied the boy to the king, yet the court never allowed him to forget what he lacked. His lineage placed him near power, but the absence of a crowned mother pushed him away from it just as quickly. Every person who looked at him seemed to measure the distance between legitimacy and inconvenience, and he fell somewhere in the space between. His title remained unspoken, hovering over him like a fragile thread that could be cut at any moment. He was acknowledged, but never embraced. Life in the palace treated him as something provisional. Servants carried him with careful hands, but their expressions held no certainty. Some addressed him respectfully, others avoided using any form of title at all. They moved around him with the quietness reserved for objects of value that might be removed without warning. His cradle, though well made, occupied a place in his mother's chamber that suggested impermanence. Nothing about the arrangement implied security. The mother felt this instability with every breath. She watched the way attendants took note of the child's movements, how their eyes flickered as though calculating futures they were too cautious to voice. Even the temperature of the room, the spacing of furniture, and the positioning of candles seemed arranged by people anticipating sudden change. She sensed that her son was always one decision away from being relocated, reassigned, or erased from daily life. Rumors intensified as he grew. Some whispered that an illegitimate prince was a danger to succession. Others speculated that the king might elevate him, granting him recognition that would unsettle established lines. Both hopes and fears placed the boy in a role he could not understand. His existence became a question the palace did not want to confront. People watched him with expressions shaped by their own ambitions. not by tenderness. The danger beneath these whispered tensions became clearer when officials visited the chamber under the pretense of routine observation. They asked questions about his feeding, his sleeping patterns, and his temperament, questions that did not seem meant to offer assistance. Their tone carried an undercurrent of assessment, as though they were determining whether he posed a risk too large to tolerate. The mother answered gently, knowing that even a hint of defensiveness could reinforce their doubts. There were stories, spoken in low voices, about children in similar positions. Some had been removed quietly from the palace, sent away to distant households under new names. Others had been placed in religious institutions, their identities altered until only a handful of people remembered who they had once been. A few had simply disappeared, with explanations so thin they dissolved under scrutiny. These stories lingered around the boy like a cold draft. The infant himself moved through his early days, unaware of the weight attached to each breath he took. His small hands grasped at the air, and his eyes followed shifting shapes of light on the walls. Yet even these innocent gestures unsettled some courtiers. They saw potential in him. Potential that could disrupt the fragile lines they depended on. Every sign of health, every sound he made, every new awareness he displayed pressed against their sense of stability. His mother watched these reactions closely. She understood that strength in her son might be interpreted as a threat, while weakness might invite decisions made without her consent. His very existence required her to navigate an impossible balance. She held him gently, aware that someone else could claim the right to decide his fate. She kept her voice low, her movements measured, trying not to draw more attention than necessary. Guards, stationed near the corridor outside her chambers, changed frequently. The rotation was explained as routine, but the unpredictability of it made her uneasy. Some guards watched her with sympathy, others avoided her gaze entirely. She could not tell which type was more dangerous. Each unfamiliar face reminded her that loyalty in the palace shifted without warning, often dictated by unseen political currents. When the child was taken for brief examinations by appointed attendants, she waited in a silence that felt heavier each time. The minutes stretched, and her breath remained tight until he was returned to her arms. These separations, though small, signaled a truth the palace did not bother to conceal. He did not fully belong to her. Decisions affecting him would be made by people whose interests did not include her well-being. As the months passed, factions began using the boy's existence as a strategic tool. Some invoked his name in arguments meant to influence the king, while others used it to undermine rivals who feared the possibility of the child gaining favor. The boy became a symbol, reshaped to suit whichever narrative benefited those speaking. None of these narratives included the mother, yet she felt their consequences in every glance directed her way. The palace treated the boy as a piece on a board, valuable, but movable. His position could be altered at any time, and his future remained undefined. The mother felt the uncertainty settle deeper into her bones. She understood that the palace protected only what it deemed useful, and usefulness could shift without warning. Everything unfolding here shows how quickly an uncertain title can place a child at the mercy of competing ambitions. Yet, beneath this unstable ground, those ambitions are beginning to pull him toward decisions far beyond his cradle. Some quiet turn in those intentions is drawing closer, carrying a direction neither he nor his mother can escape. Queens in the Tudor court carried their crowns with a weight the palace never cared to acknowledge. Their authority appeared polished from a distance. Yet beneath the surface lay a constant fear, the existence of another woman's son. A child born outside their chambers could undo years of careful loyalty, devotion, and endurance. Even the smallest rumor about such a child pressed against their composure, reminding them how fragile their positions truly were. Power, for them, was something that required constant vigilance. Jane Seymour learned this truth only briefly. Her triumph in giving the king a son marked her as the most celebrated woman in the realm. The court bowed to her. Servants moved with reverence, and advisers spoke her name with softened tones. Yet the joy surrounding her did not last. Her death followed quickly, turning admiration into mourning. The palace carried on, but her passing left a cold lesson behind. Even the woman who succeeded where others had failed could not escape the dangers tied to childbirth. Her life had been shaped by the pressure to produce a male heir, and that pressure consumed her before she could enjoy what it promised. Catherine of Aragon knew a different kind of fear. She lived under the unspoken burden of repeated loss, each failed pregnancy eroding her security in the palace. People watched her with restrained sympathy that did little to ease the strain. Her inability to give the king a surviving son became a quiet weapon used against her, sharpening the distance between her and those who sought advantage. Whispers drifted through the corridors, suggesting that another woman might succeed where she could not. Every such whisper tightened the air around her like a binding she could not break. She carried herself with dignity, but the court interpreted dignity as stubbornness, not strength. Anne Boleyn faced a harsher end. Her brilliance and confidence had once captivated the king, allowing her to rise above a queen who had served the realm for decades. But her rise made her vulnerable. When she delivered a daughter instead of the anticipated son, tension began to close around her like a tightening ring. Miscarriages followed, each one weakening her place in the palace. Every loss fed the ambitions of her enemies. They watched her carefully, waiting for the moment her position could be dismantled. Her final miscarriage, rumoured to be a son, became the final shift that pushed her toward accusations, trials, and execution. In the Tudor court, even the absence of a child could become grounds for destruction. Behind each queen's story lingered the same quiet reality. The king's desire for a male heir shaped their lives more than any personal bond he shared with them. Their survival depended not simply on loyalty or wisdom, but on their ability to produce a boy who lived beyond infancy. The palace judged them by outcomes they could not control. Physicians offered little help. Midwives could not prevent tragedy, and the court displayed no patience for misfortune. Their bodies became battlegrounds for political stability, and their value was weighed against the lives they could bring forth. When another woman produced a son, even if that woman held no title, the queens felt the threat immediately. A single child could shift the king's affection, disrupt alliances, and open paths toward alternative succession. The queens concealed their discomfort behind calm expressions, but the palace noticed everything. Their steps grew slower, their words more measured, their nights heavier with unspoken fear. They understood that the palace would celebrate a newborn boy, regardless of who bore him, and that celebration could become a quiet erosion of their authority. People beyond the royal chambers sensed these tensions as well. Servants exchanged brief, uncertain glances when news of a new pregnancy circulated. Advisers debated discreetly in corners, gauging how a queen's position might change if another woman succeeded where she had struggled. The stability of the entire realm seemed to rest upon events that unfolded behind closed doors. In dimly lit chambers, where only a few attendants stood witness, the queens carried themselves with practiced grace through all of this. They attended ceremonies, greeted visitors, and fulfilled duties with unwavering composure. Yet beneath the layers of silk and jewelry, their thoughts remained fixed on the same fear, the fragile line between survival and replacement. Their crowns did not shield them from uncertainty. Instead, the crowns intensified it. In the end, the queen's place in the Tudor world depended less on her power and more on the presence, or absence, of a living son. Every child born to another woman reminded her that the palace could change direction without warning, and that her influence might vanish in a single turn of fortune. Beneath the grandeur lay a truth none of them could ignore. Everything unfolding here shows how even crowned women lived under the shadow of children who were not theirs. Yet, within this growing pressure, the court's unease is beginning to settle more heavily upon the newborn himself. Another quiet turn in that unease is drawing closer, carrying implications his mother cannot outrun. Power in the Tudor court often began in a cradle, yet nothing was more fragile than the life placed inside it. A newborn prince carried all the hopes of a dynasty, all the calculations of factions, and all the ambitions of the adults who watched him breathe. But his survival was never assured. The palace knew this, and so did the women who bore these children. Even in the quietest hours, when the candles were dim and the corridors empty, fear lingered closer than comfort. A single night could undo everything. Infant mortality hovered like a constant shadow. Physicians lacked the tools to understand or prevent the illnesses that swept through nurseries. Midwives worked with experience, but had no real ability to stop infections or complications. Servants followed rituals passed down through generations. Yet none of them prevented sudden fevers, trembling limbs, or breaths that faded without warning. A baby could appear healthy in the morning and be gone before the next bell rang. For a prince, the stakes were even higher. Not because his body was different, but because his death carried consequences the entire court felt. The mothers understood these risks intimately. They watched their children with a vigilance born from grief witnessed too many times. They had seen other women hold still infants in their arms, their bodies drained of sound, while courtiers exchanged calculated expressions behind them. They had seen the way a queen's importance shifted the moment her child failed to survive. A once powerful woman could become an afterthought overnight. Her influence did not fade gently. It disappeared with the extinguishing of a heartbeat. Even a living prince was not necessarily safe. The cold air of the palace drifted through cracks in the walls. The tapestries and heavy curtains could not keep illness at bay. Attendants tried to warm the rooms, but winter seeped through the stone no matter how many hearths burned. Firewood could not shield a child from infections, nor could silken blankets stitched with royal emblems. The fragility of a newborn made every detail in the chamber feel like a quiet threat. Courtiers paid attention to the baby's health with an interest that was rarely compassionate. They observed his colour, his cries, and the steadiness of his breathing. Any sign of weakness could spark whispers that might reach the king's ears before the mother's tears had even dried. A prince who struggled to feed or sleep invited speculation about heredity, divine displeasure, or political opportunity. Those hoping to diminish his mother seized on every hint of frailty, turning the nursery into a battlefield of quiet judgments. The father, though king, could not shield the infant from danger. His authority did not ward off sickness, nor did his affection guarantee life. Some kings visited the nursery often, others kept a distance to avoid emotional attachment. But regardless of their approach, power alone did nothing to protect the child. The unpredictability of infant survival humbled even monarchs. If a prince died, the king mourned. But the court calculated. Another woman might rise. Another alliance might form. Another future might take shape. For the mother, the uncertainty was nearly unbearable. She measured time not by festivals or ceremonies, but by the intervals between her child's breaths. Every soft sound brought relief. Every silence sharpened fear. She slept lightly, knowing attendants could wake her at any hour with news that would unmake her world. The cradle carried not only the boy's life, but her entire place within the palace. Without him, she risked becoming invisible. Or worse, inconvenient. Loss in the Tudor court did not invite empathy. Grief was expected to be quiet and brief. A mother who lost her son might receive formal condolences. But beyond that, the palace moved on quickly. The machinery of power had no space for lingering sorrow. A dead prince meant strategies adjusted, alliances reconsidered, and new expectations placed upon women whose bodies had already borne enough strain. The court did not pause to honour the child. It recalibrated around his absence. This indifference intensified the mother's dread. She knew her tears would not change her standing. She knew her pain would not slow the court's shifting attention. Her son's survival was the only shield she possessed. And that shield was frighteningly thin, even in moments of warmth. When the child slept against her chest or wrapped tiny fingers around her hand, she felt the nearness of uncertainty. Every infant prince lived beneath the weight of a fragile privilege. The title he carried brought both admiration and danger. People bowed to him, yet some waited silently for his death. The palace celebrated his birth, but its history reminded everyone how brief such celebrations could be. The child's life was precious only as long as it continued. If it slipped away, so did the mother's protection. Everything unfolding here shows how a child's breath could determine a woman's future more than any vow or crown ever could. Yet, as this quiet danger closes in, the court's watchful eyes are beginning to shift toward the mothers themselves. Some deeper tension is settling around them, carrying consequences neither of them nor their children can avoid. Rivalries in the Tudor palace rarely announced themselves with raised voices or open threats. They unfolded in quiet corners, in softened greetings, in glances that lingered a moment too long. The women who lived behind the palace walls understood that motherhood did not free them from politics, it pulled them deeper into it. Every cradle held a possibility, and every possibility carried a sharpened edge. A mother's ambition did not need to be spoken. It moved in the way she positioned herself at court, the way she guarded her child, the way she watched other women with measured caution. Each of them knew that the path to influence was narrow, and only one child could stand at its end. Attempts to secure that path took forms so subtle that they were almost invisible. A harmless comment about an infant's health could seed doubt in the mind of a nobleman. A misplaced word about a child's lineage could shift an advisor's loyalty. Even silence could be a weapon when used by someone who understood how the king interpreted quiet hesitation. The mothers learned to speak gently, but each sentence carried layers beneath the surface. Their smiles remained soft, but their intentions never softened. The nursery itself became an arena. Servants observed the mothers, aware that their loyalty would determine which child was bathed first, fed first, or comforted first. These small actions, insignificant in an ordinary household, signaled favour in the palace. A mother who felt her child was receiving less care might complain quietly to an official, who would then pass the concern along to someone else, turning a simple grievance into a political calculation. Even the toys placed beside a child's bed could provoke whispers about preference or neglect. Rumours played a central role in the struggle. They drifted through the chambers like smoke, impossible to grasp, but equally impossible to ignore. Some claimed that a certain child was weak, prone to illness, unlikely to survive. Others insinuated that a rival mother was manipulating attendants to hide her own child's frailty. These stories rarely held truth, yet their impact was real. A rumor, once released, could move faster than any official decree. It slipped beneath doors, clung to conversations, and shaped expectations before anyone could contain it. Whispers about poison surfaced often enough that no one dismissed them outright. Poison did not need to be delivered in obvious ways. A drop of something in a cup meant for a servant could find its way into a child's food. A cloth soaked in fragrant oils could irritate an infant's skin until illness followed. Even the suggestion of poison could destroy a woman's standing, placing her under suspicion that was impossible to erase. The mothers understood this and guarded their children with vigilance that bordered on desperation. Some women sought protection through alliances. They befriended influential nobles, hoping their support would shield their sons from harm. Others strengthened ties with religious figures, believing spiritual favor might offer safety where politics could not. But alliances shifted quickly. A noble who praised one child today might champion another tomorrow if it brought him closer to the king. Trust became a fragile currency, spent carefully and often regretted. The children themselves remained unaware of the tensions surrounding them. They reached out with innocent hands, laughed at passing gestures, and cried without knowing the weight their tears carried. Yet every movement was interpreted by someone. A child who crawled early might be deemed promising. One who struggled to speak could be labelled weak. These assessments, made by people who knew little about childhood, shaped the strategies of mothers who felt the pressure of expectation pressing tighter with each passing day. The fathers, though powerful, contributed little to diffusing these tensions. The king's attention shifted often, guided by politics, affection, or frustration. He could elevate one child with a single word or disregard another with a simple gesture. His unpredictability made the mother's efforts even more frantic. They had to secure their children's positions not only against rivals but also against the king's changing moods. His favour was precious but unstable, and instability was dangerous. Servants learned to navigate these rivalries with care. Their loyalties could be bought, influenced, or forced. A servant who praised one mother in public might privately support another. Some shared small pieces of information between households, hoping to remain in favour regardless of who rose. Their actions did not decide the outcome of the larger struggle, but they shaped the daily atmosphere in ways that fed the mother's fears. The palace corridors absorbed everything, the soft footsteps of women moving through the shadows, the murmurs exchanged at doorways, the sharp breaths of mothers awakened by sudden fears that their children were unsafe. In these stone halls, ambition pressed against the walls like damp air. It settled into tapestries, seeped through carved wooden doors, and lingered over cradles where infants slept unaware of their roles. No act of tenderness could erase the knowledge shared among the women. Only one child would ascend, and every other mother was an obstacle. Their rivalry was not loud, but it was relentless. They smiled when necessary, bowed when required, and waited for opportunities that appeared without warning. A misstep by a rival, a moment of weakness, a poorly timed illness. Any of these could shift the balance. Their world allowed no innocence, not even in motherhood. Everything unfolding here shows how ambition turned even shared womanhood into a quiet battlefield. Yet beneath these calculated gestures, greater dangers are beginning to stir around the children themselves. Another emerging thread in this conflict is tightening, carrying a consequence none of them will be fully prepared to face. Disappearances in the Tudor court did not resemble dramatic abductions or desperate chases through dark corridors. They unfolded quietly, with a stillness so complete that those closest to the child often learned the truth only after the absence could no longer be denied. A cradle left undisturbed, a blanket folded too neatly, an attendant unable to meet a mother's eyes. These were the signs that something had changed. The silence following such moments felt heavier than any cry. It suggested that whatever had happened, it had been both intentional and permitted by those who benefited from it. Infants considered inconvenient to the political balance often vanished with alarming ease. A servant might claim the child fell ill during the night and was taken to be examined. Hours later, the explanation shifted, now suggesting that the baby had already passed away. Nobody would be shown, no burial witnessed. Those who requested proof were met with vague reassurances or reminders of their place in the hierarchy. The court excelled at shaping narratives, and a missing child could be folded into a story before suspicion had time to form. Records related to these children frequently reflected the same ambiguity. A birth might be documented with care, only for later pages to contain contradictory statements. Names would be misspelled, dates adjusted, margins scrubbed clean. When questions arose, clerks insisted they had copied information exactly as given. But the gaps, too neat, too convenient, betrayed the truth. Erasure did not require fire, it needed only intention. The palace understood how to make a child disappear twice, first from the world, and then from memory. Accidents provided another convenient explanation. Wet floors, unattended candles, sudden illnesses. Each offered a plausible story when told by someone with enough authority. Yet behind these claims lay patterns too deliberate to ignore. A child who threatened succession might fall from an open window despite the presence of multiple attendants. Another might choke on food he was too young to eat. These tragedies were presented to the public as misfortune. But in the shadows of the palace, people understood that misfortune did not strike so precisely. Servants often sensed discrepancies long before anyone spoke them aloud. They noticed changes in the atmosphere. Guards stationed more densely near a mother's door. Advisors holding hushed meetings. Physicians arriving unannounced. They moved through the palace with lowered heads, careful not to reveal concern. Servants who asked too many questions risked reassignment, dismissal, or worse. Their silence became part of the mechanism that allowed disappearances to occur without resistance. The mothers suffered most, yet their grief was contained behind closed doors. A woman who questioned the circumstances of her child's disappearance endangered herself. If she pressed too forcefully, she could be accused of hysteria, disloyalty, or disruption of the king's peace. Some chose to accept the official story to protect themselves. Others clung to quiet suspicions that never left their lips. Their sorrow became a muted echo in a palace that had no patience for mourning, only for stability. Whispers among courtiers carried a sharper edge. They speculated about motives, about who benefited from each disappearance, about which factions had gained strength as a result. Yet these conversations avoided names. Everyone understood that speaking too directly could expose them to accusations of disloyalty. Instead, they spoke in abstractions, a necessary adjustment, a regretted turn, the will of fate. These phrases allowed them to acknowledge the truth without confronting it. Occasionally, rumors suggested that some children had not died at all. Stories surfaced about infants taken to distant estates, hidden in monasteries, or raised under false names. These tales were rarely confirmed, but neither were they dismissed entirely. The possibility that a child lived on in secrecy fed the anxieties of those who preferred the certainty of complete removal. A living child, even in exile. You could return one day with a claim neither time nor politics could fully extinguish. Meanwhile, the palace continued with its routines as though nothing had occurred. Ceremonies proceeded. Advisors debated. Alliances shifted. The disappearance of a single infant, however tragic, did not slow the machinery of power. Instead, it became another quiet adjustment, absorbed into the rhythm of court life. The walls recorded nothing. The halls echoed nothing. Only the mothers carried the weight of what had happened. In the end, the mystery surrounding these vanishings was not rooted in complexity, but in simplicity. Those who wanted the child gone had the means, the access, and the authority. Those who wished to protect the child lacked all three. The result was a pattern of absence that repeated across generations, shaped less by malice than by cold calculation. A prince who complicated the line of succession could be removed without fanfare, leaving behind only silence and carefully altered records. Everything unfolding here shows how a child could slip from the world as quietly as a candle extinguished by a passing draft. Yet within this unsettling stillness, the court's attention is beginning to shift toward the mothers who survived these losses. A quiet force is gathering around them, carrying a dread that will not be eased by silence. A prince's death in the Tudor court rarely ended with mourning alone. It reshaped the air, altered alliances, and shifted the balance between those who held influence and those who waited in the shadows for an opportunity to rise. The silence, following the announcement, felt unnatural, too controlled, too purposeful. It signaled not only loss but recalculation. Even before the child's body cooled, whispers began to circulate. Soft, careful, but unmistakably directed toward the future. A single death could ripple outward, reaching corners of the palace untouched by the infant's short life. The reactions to such a death varied with unsettling predictability. Some women wept openly, reflecting genuine grief intertwined with fear for their own positions. Others bowed their heads only briefly, masking relief beneath layers of etiquette. A few offered consoling words with rehearsed solemnity, aware that sincerity mattered far less than perception. The court had no patience for lingering sorrow. Expressions of emotion were measured against political necessity. Even tears became a performance shaped by expectations rather than truth. Behind these gestures lay motivations sharpened by survival. A dead prince opened space for other children to be considered, other mothers to gain favour, and other families to position themselves closer to the king. The court viewed the prince not as an innocent lost, but as a shift in the line of succession. The mother, stripped of her shield, often found herself surrounded by advisers whose sympathy felt thin. They spoke of fate, of divine will, of the fragility of infants. But their eyes drifted toward new possibilities. Her grief became secondary to the larger question now circulating. Who would benefit next? Rumours, as always, spread faster than facts. Some suggested negligence. Others whispered about illness. A few dared imply something more deliberate. These whispers grew especially sharp when the boy's death coincided with rising ambitions elsewhere in the court. Poison, mishandled treatments, or ignored symptoms. Each theory gained traction depending on who stood to profit. The truth often dissolved under layers of speculation, replaced by interpretations that suited whichever faction spoke loudest. Reality mattered less than advantage. The king's reaction set the rhythm for the court. Some kings retreated briefly into private chambers, grieving in solitude before returning to political matters. Others responded with simmering frustration, directing their anger at advisers, physicians, or even the mother. His mood determined how carefully courtiers stepped, how quickly factions adjusted their plans, and how aggressively they pursued new alliances. Grief and strategy are intertwined, indistinguishable from each other. For attendants who cared for the child, the loss settled heavily. They felt the absence most intimately. The empty crib, the still blankets, the toys untouched. Yet they too adjusted quickly, aware that lingering sorrow could be misinterpreted as disloyalty. Their duties shifted within hours, reassigned to other chambers, other infants, other priorities. The palace consumed them with the same efficiency it applied to everything else. The mother, however, faced a quieter devastation. Her chamber grew colder, not because she had lost her child, but because others had stopped needing her. Without a living heir, her influence evaporated. Visits from nobles declined. Conversations shortened. Servants moved with caution around her, as though proximity to a fallen figure might tarnish their own standing. The court did not comfort her. It watched her. Every expression, every pause, every breath became another detail to interpret. In the days following the prince's death, decisions were made swiftly. Advisors discussed succession implications. Clerks amended records. Priests offered prayers that felt more ceremonial than compassionate. The machinery of court life did not slow. It simply shifted direction. The prince's brief life became a footnote, absorbed into the palace's unending pursuit of stability. His death, though tragic, was also seen as an opportunity, an opening for someone else to rise. Some mothers in the palace felt a surge of hope they dared not reveal. Their children now had clearer paths. Their alliances carried more weight. Their conversations with key figures took on new meaning. They hid these feelings behind carefully arranged expressions of sorrow, aware that revealing relief would invite suspicion or retaliation. Yet internally, they understood the calculation. A dead prince removed one obstacle, and survival demanded that they acknowledge the advantage. In this world, mourning and ambition coexisted without contradiction. A single event could evoke both compassion and opportunity. Each mother feared such outcomes for her own child, yet recognized them as necessary when they affected someone else's. The palace rewarded those who adapted quickly, who interpreted loss without sentiment, who moved forward without hesitation. A prince's death did not end anything. It began things. Alliances, conflicts, shifts in loyalty. It reshaped futures that had once seemed stable. In the Tudor court, tragedy was not an interruption but part of the rhythm. The grief of a mother might echo through the halls, but behind that echo, footsteps were already moving toward the newly opened space. Everything unfolding here shows how a single death could lift one woman while destroying another. Yet beneath these shifting loyalties, the tension surrounding infant heirs is starting to settle into something colder. One deeper fracture is forming in the shadows, carrying consequences the court has long feared. The separation between a mother and her newborn prince began almost immediately after birth. The court framed it as tradition, as necessity, as the proper order of things. But none of those explanations softened its cruelty. Once the infant took his first breaths, attendants stepped forward, lifting him from his mother's arms with the practiced calm of people who had done this many times before. Their movements were gentle, but their certainty left no room for objection. The child belonged to the palace now, not to the woman who had carried him. She watched as he was taken to another chamber, further away than the distance measured by stone walls. Nurses and selected servants became his family, chosen for their reliability, their discipline, and their discretion. They fed him, soothed him, and monitored every sound he made. They were trained to respond without hesitation, to follow rules without questioning, and to keep the child insulated from anything deemed unnecessary, including his own mother's presence. Their loyalty was monitored closely, and any misstep could lead to abrupt removal. To the court, a prince required constant oversight. Affection was secondary, nearly irrelevant. The mother was allowed to visit, but her visits resembled supervised encounters rather than moments of intimacy. She entered the nursery with measured steps, aware that several pairs of eyes were fixed on her. Attendants stood close, not out of respect but out of obligation. They recorded how long she held the child, how she spoke to him, how her expression shifted at each small movement. Any display deemed excessive, too tender, too distressed, or too hopeful could be interpreted as a sign of emotional instability. The palace valued restraint more than warmth. Her child, meanwhile, grew accustomed to other arms, other voices, other breaths beside his crib. The woman who had endured months of uncertainty, fear, and pain to bring him into the world became a figure who appeared only in fragments. Brief visits, softened words, controlled touches. He learned to recognize his nurses first, not because he rejected his mother, but because the court structured his world that way. His earliest attachments were not shaped by her presence but by her absence. The mother carried this distance like a quiet wound. Every time she approached the nursery, she prepared herself for the same ritual: a polite greeting from the nurse, a nod from the guard at the door, and the brief moment when she was permitted to sit beside the crib. She touched the child's hair cautiously, aware that the attendants watched for any movement that might suggest an attempt to assert more influence than allowed. Even the way she held him had to be controlled. Too tightly, and she risked suspicion. Too loosely, and she seemed indifferent. Her emotions were inspected just as thoroughly as her behavior. If her eyes lingered on the child too long, some might interpret it as longing that bordered on defiance. If she held back tears, others might see it as detachment. The court had little patience for genuine grief or joy. Both were considered disruptive. She walked a narrow path between expectation and judgment, knowing that any misinterpreted gesture could jeopardize her already fragile position. Distance became a form of governance, by controlling who touched the child, who spoke to him, and who stayed in the room. The palace shaped not only his upbringing, but also the mother's obedience. The separation sent a clear message. Her role was biological, not parental. Her body had been necessary. Her presence was not. She was tolerated only to the extent that her involvement did not interfere with political designs. If she questioned this arrangement openly, she risked being barred from the nursery entirely. Behind closed doors, she grieved the lost intimacy. She remembered how he had once rested against her chest, how his breath had warmed her skin, how his small fingers had curled around her own. Those moments felt distant now, like remnants from another life. She returned to her rooms, carrying a pain she could not express. Servants sensed it, but said nothing, understanding too well that sympathy offered aloud could be overheard and misunderstood. The child, meanwhile, thrived or withered under the watch of those deemed loyal. His mother learned of his progress through filtered reports. He fed well. He slept poorly. He smiled today. He cried in the night. These updates were delivered with professional detachment. They informed her of his life without allowing her to participate in it. She existed on the edges of his world, present but peripheral. Even when she held him, the moment was never truly hers. An attendant hovered nearby, making slight adjustments to the blanket, the child's position, or the angle of the light. Each adjustment reminded her that she was not trusted to decide even the smallest detail. She was supervised not because she was incapable, but because she was unnecessary. The palace did not intend to harm her. It simply had no place for her beyond her reproductive value. Over time, she learned to mask her longing beneath calm expressions. She smiled when expected, spoke politely to those who controlled access to her child, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that felt both hollow and necessary. Her restraint was not a reflection of her feelings, but a strategy for survival. She understood the stakes. Proximity to her child depended on her ability to appear obedient, composed, and non-threatening. This separation, though framed as customary, revealed a deeper truth about the palace itself. Mothers who bore princes were honored briefly, then overshadowed by the structures designed to protect the child from them. Their love was not forbidden, but it was tightly contained. The court preferred children shaped by politics, not affection. Everything unfolding here shows how a mother could be reduced to a visitor in her own child's life. Yet, beneath these controlled encounters, the pressure surrounding her is beginning to constrict in ways she cannot fully see. Some quiet shift in that pressure is drawing near, carrying consequences she will have no power to resist. Isolation in the Tudor court rarely appeared violent at first glance. It settled slowly, beginning with a reduced number of visitors. The quiet removal of certain attendants and the subtle rearrangement of guards near a woman's chamber. These changes were justified with gentle phrases. For her rest, for the child's protection, for the stability of the palace. Yet, beneath the softness of those words lay a harsher intention. Once a mother had given birth to a child whose existence threatened the balance of power. Her world narrowed with startling speed. Freedom became a memory, preserved only in her mind. Rooms that once felt spacious began to feel smaller. Doors that had remained open now closed with deliberate care. Servants approached her with new caution, offering politeness that sounded rehearsed rather than sincere. Their movements carried an edge of hesitation, as though they feared even standing too close might be interpreted incorrectly by those watching from the shadows. The woman sensed these shifts before anyone explained them. She understood that confinement did not always require chains. Sometimes it required nothing more than restricted access and the quiet obedience of those around her. Guards stationed outside her chamber grew more numerous. They greeted her with the same courtesy as before, but the constancy of their presence revealed the truth. They were not protecting her. They were containing her. Their faces changed often, making it difficult for her to recognize patterns of loyalty. Some guards avoided eye contact, others observed her movements too carefully, a reminder that every gesture she made could be reported. The palace documented her silence as closely as her speech. The justification for her confinement varied depending on who told the story. Some claimed she was being shielded from political turmoil. Others insisted she required time to recover from childbirth. A few suggested that her emotional state was too fragile for public appearances. None of these explanations addressed the underlying reason. She carried knowledge, and that knowledge could disrupt carefully constructed narratives. Her child's parentage, the circumstances of conception, or the king's intentions. Any of these could fracture alliances if spoken aloud. Supervision became constant. Attendants remained in the room longer than necessary, adjusting blankets, straightening candles, and offering water she did not ask for. Their tasks were excuses to stay close. They listened as she breathed, as she shifted in her chair, as she whispered to herself in moments of exhaustion. When she requested privacy, they responded with gentle apologies and vague statements about orders they could not ignore. She ate under watchful eyes. She slept knowing someone was stationed steps away, waiting for the slightest disturbance. Even letters, once her only lifeline to trusted allies, were filtered. Messages she attempted to send disappeared into the hands of officials who promised to deliver them. Replies rarely arrived. When they did, they were stripped of warmth, as though the writer feared implicating themselves. She learned to speak less, write less, and hope less. The walls of her chamber absorbed her frustration without echo. Over time, her isolation took on the weight of ritual. The same meals arrived at the same hours. The same attendants entered with the same practiced politeness. The same narrow strip of corridor was visible through the same small opening in the door. Routine replaced uncertainty, but not comfort. She understood that predictability served the palace. It kept her quiet, compliant, and easy to manage. The child she had given birth to remained nearby, but not within reach. If she asked to visit him, officials cited his health, his schedule, or the need for controlled surroundings. Her access was rationed like a privilege rather than a right. She saw him only in intervals, brief enough to prevent connection, long enough to remind her of what she could not have. Each visit ended with the same ache, a hollow sensation that lingered long after she returned to her chamber. Occasionally, she overheard fragments of conversation from passing servants. They spoke of her as though she were an abstract concern. The mother in the East Wing, the woman under watch, the one who must remain quiet. Their tone carried neither malice nor sympathy. They did not consider her suffering. They considered her potential to disrupt. In the logic of the palace, her confinement was not punishment. It was a precaution. Her isolation deepened when rumors circulated that she knew too much. Allegations shaped themselves with little evidence, that she might reveal private conversations with the king, that she had confided in the wrong person, that she understood the lineage disputes better than she should. These rumors justified stricter measures. The door to her chamber remained open only when commanded. Visitors were limited to those selected by officials. Even her clothing and personal items were inspected, as though hidden messages might be stitched into the seams. Days blurred together. She marked time by the shifting light against the stone walls, by the soft footsteps of guards changing shifts, by the faint chimes from distant rooms. Her world contracted into a narrow space. She could neither escape nor reshape. The palace expected her to adapt, to accept silence as her companion, confinement as her shelter, and obedience as her protection. Yet beneath her stillness, a quiet dread took root. She understood that confinement was rarely temporary. The palace released people only when it no longer feared them. And fear, once formed, held tightly. Everything unfolding here shows how isolation became a tool that silenced women more effectively than force ever could. Yet beneath this controlled quiet, the court's suspicions are beginning to drift toward the child himself. Another shift in that suspicion is approaching, carrying a threat neither mother nor infant can avoid. Jealousy in the Tudor court did not resemble the dramatic confrontations whispered about in later tales. It unfolded in quiet tensions, in altered expressions, in the stillness that settled between two people who once stood united in purpose. When another woman bore the king a son, the shift in the queen's world occurred instantly, almost imperceptibly, but with unmistakable force. The king's attention, once steady, or at least predictable, tilted toward the new mother. His visits became more frequent, his gestures softened, his words carried an ease he had not shown in months. The court observed these changes, and the queen felt their weight even before anyone dared to speak of them. Her authority, once unquestioned, now trembled beneath the surface. She sensed it in the way advisors paused before addressing her, as though recalibrating their tone. She noticed it in the way noble women lowered their eyes slightly longer than necessary, offering courtesy tinged with pity. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. She had lost something that could not be regained through charm or diplomacy. A son born to another woman created a fracture in her position that no ceremony or proclamation could mend. The king himself rarely acknowledged this change, perhaps unaware of how visible it had become. He carried a new pride, a glow sharpened by the arrival of a male heir. His steps felt lighter, his voice more buoyant. The queen recognized these signs, having once inspired them herself in earlier hopes and failed attempts. Now they belonged to someone else. She presented a composed face, speaking with grace and fulfilling her duties with discipline. But beneath her calm exterior lay a quiet ache. She understood that affection in the palace was not constant. It followed lineage, not loyalty. Other women in the court reacted swiftly. Some aligned themselves with the new mother, sensing opportunity in the king's shifting attention. Others remained loyal to the queen, but whispered their concerns behind closed doors. Alliances that once seemed stable fractured along new lines. The palace reshaped itself around the child whose presence had altered the current of daily life. Even those who had no love for the queen now sympathized with her position, recognizing that her fall could signal their own vulnerability. The queen's emotions, though carefully restrained, ran deep. She did not rage or accuse. She did not plead for the king's attention or protest the new mother's rising influence. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, allowing silence to conceal what her heart refused to reveal. This restraint protected her, but it also isolated her. The court rewarded composure, yet it exploited it too. Her measured demeanor made it easier for others to overlook her suffering, as though poise were proof of indifference rather than endurance. Resentment simmered beneath the surface. It did not erupt in overt hostility. It seeped into gestures too small to confront. A slightly delayed greeting, a lowered voice when speaking about the infant, a glance that lingered just long enough to suggest doubt. The queen recognized these signs and responded with the same careful politeness she had mastered long ago. She understood that any display of jealousy would be used against her. The court interpreted emotion not as humanity but as weakness. The new mother, aware of the queen's silent turmoil, moved through the palace with mixed emotions of her own. Her triumph brought status, but it also invited danger. She sensed the hostility behind smiles, the scrutiny behind compliments. She felt the queen's eyes upon her, not with overt malice, but with a heaviness shaped by years of expectation and disappointment. Their interactions carried a tension neither could name aloud. Both women were bound by the same king, the same court, the same precarious roles. Yet their positions were now divided by a child who could not understand the burden he represented. The king's behavior intensified this division. His visits to the nursery, once infrequent, became routine. His praise for the infant carried a warmth that stung the queen more deeply than any insult. He lingered near the new mother with an ease that sent ripples through the palace. Courtiers took note, adjusting their loyalties with the precision of men accustomed to surviving political storms. Each shift in their behavior reminded the queen of her altered place in the hierarchy. In private, she carried her emotions like a fragile object she dared not set down. She mourned not only the king's wandering attention, but the independence she had lost to the court's expectations. Her once assured future had been rewritten by a birth she could not control. Every corridor she walked, every chamber she entered, reflected a world that now measured her worth differently. She felt the sting of each whisper, each half-hidden glance, each polite inquiry laced with superiority. The tension between the two women grew, not through open conflict, but through the quiet hostility that shapes rivalries in places where emotion must remain concealed. They exchanged formal greetings with flawless courtesy, yet their eyes revealed everything their voices could not. This rivalry did not require accusations or confrontations. It deepened in silence, fed by the knowledge that both women's futures hinged on the same fragile source: the king's regard for the child. The queen understood that retaliation had to be subtle. Any direct action would expose her to accusations of cruelty or disloyalty. Instead, she relied on quiet strategies, withholding certain favors, adjusting ceremonial roles, or supporting officials who subtly limited the new mother's influence. These measures rarely appeared aggressive, yet their cumulative effect created barriers that the new mother could feel, even if she could not trace them clearly. The rivalry, though quiet, shaped the atmosphere of the palace. Every gesture carried meaning, every silence carried threat. The women moved through this landscape with calculated care, understanding that their survival depended on the ability to navigate these shifts without misstep. The king remained the axis around which they orbited, yet his presence offered little stability. Everything unfolding here shows how affection, once lost, could reshape a queen's entire world. Yet beneath these fragile courtesies, the palace is beginning to move toward a colder negotiation of power. A deeper stillness is forming around the king's shifting loyalties, carrying consequences neither woman can fully anticipate. Arranged marriages in the Tudor court often carried the quiet brutality of decisions made far from the woman they targeted. When a prince was born to a mother, the palace deemed inconvenient. Officials wasted little time in proposing a solution disguised as necessity. They framed it with words like stability, order, and protection. But beneath these justifications lay a simpler truth. Removing the mother from the king's orbit preserved the palace's balance. Her presence near the child, near the throne, near power itself, was a risk too great to leave unattended. The announcement rarely came with a warning. A council member might visit her chamber with polite smiles, offering praise for her service to the realm before presenting a marriage contract she had never requested. They spoke of her future as though it were a gift, describing estates she would reside in, and the man chosen to become her husband. Their tone remained gentle, but the firmness in their eyes revealed that refusal was not an option. By the time the conversation ended, decisions had been made without her voice, without her consent, without even the illusion of choice. Once these arrangements began, the mother felt the ground beneath her shift abruptly. The visits she once received dwindled. Advisors who previously displayed sympathy now kept their distance. Servants changed their manner toward her, addressing her with a formality that suggested she no longer belonged to the inner sphere of court life. Her world, once shaped around the child she had borne, now felt poised to collapse inward. Every step she took seemed to echo a future she did not control. The man selected for her was rarely someone of influence. More often, he was a minor noble, loyal enough to obey the crown, but insignificant enough to pose no threat. His role was not to honor her, but to dilute her influence. Marriage to him blurred her connection to the king. weakening any perception that she could leverage her child's birth for status. These unions were not built on compatibility or mutual respect. They were crafted to erase her quietly, placing her in a new household where her voice mattered little and her past was treated as something to overlook. Such marriages demanded an immediate separation from the prince. The palace insisted it was essential for the child's upbringing, claiming he required stability, proper governance, and environments free from emotional turmoil. But the mother understood the underlying intent. Distance between her and her son prevented her from influencing his future or challenging the court's plans for him. She watched as attendants prepared the child's belongings, folding blankets she once held against her chest, organizing items she knew he recognized by scent alone. Each object taken from her sight felt like another thread cut. Her departure from the palace unfolded with the same quiet precision as her confinement. Guards escorted her through corridors she had once walked with purpose. Servants bowed mechanically, their expressions careful, neither warm nor cold, just neutral enough to avoid implication. She passed doorways where she once stood, waiting for news of her child, and corridors where she had prayed for the king's favor. Now those spaces felt distant, unreachable, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. In her new marriage, she became a symbol stripped of influence. Her husband treated her with polite restraint, uncertain how to navigate the presence of a woman once connected to the king. He followed the expectations placed upon him, offering stability that the court valued more than affection. Her days settled into routines dictated by lands, or servants, and duties far removed from the palace. She learned to speak less, to move quietly, to accept her new role with the same composure demanded of her before. The crown had not jailed her with walls, it had confined her with circumstance. Yet the ache of separation from her child never eased. She wondered whether he remembered her scent, whether he still turned at the sound of her voice in dreams, whether the attendants spoke of her gently or let her memory fade. The palace allowed no letters, no message, no tokens exchanged in secret. She existed for him only in the spaces others chose to leave unfilled. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing month, pressing against her until it became part of her breathing. Few dared acknowledge the cruelty of this arrangement. Courtiers defended these marriages as solutions to political tension. Priests justified them as paths to moral balance. Even the king, who once held her close, signed the documents with the detachment of a man accustomed to rearranging lives. In the logic of the palace, she had served her purpose. Her usefulness now rested in her ability to disappear with dignity. But disappearance did not erase what she knew. It did not erase the pain beneath her calm exterior, or the understanding that she had been reshaped to fit a narrative others controlled. It did not erase the knowledge that her child's future depended on forces she could no longer reach. She lived in quiet exile, neither honored nor condemned, simply placed aside, like something once important but now inconvenient. In this world, marriage became a tool sharper than any blade. It cut ties, silenced voices, and repositioned lives without sound. It created an appearance of order while reinforcing deeper fractures beneath the surface. And the women at the center of these arrangements bore the consequences long after the court moved on. Everything unfolding here shows how marriage could erase a woman more effectively than banishment. Yet beneath this forced calm, shifting loyalties in the palace are beginning to strain against each other once again. Some slow-breaking tension is forming behind closed doors, carrying a consequence that will soon reach the children themselves. Political needs in the Tudor court had a way of reaching into the quiet spaces of childhood, reshaping lives long before those children could speak their own names. A newborn prince who did not fit the court's future could be redirected, disguised, or erased through decisions made in rooms he would never enter. His presence was measured not by innocence, but by strategic value. If his existence complicated alliances, offended factions, or threatened established power. Solutions emerged swiftly, always framed as necessary, always silent about the cost. Whispers often began before a child had taken his first steps. Advisors held long discussions late into the night, voices low as they debated what stability demanded. A boy born to a woman the court rejected, or at a moment when the king's favour wavered, could instantly become a burden. His lineage might offer legitimacy, temptation, or danger, depending on who examined it. In the eyes of those who governed, the child himself mattered less than the shadows cast by his name. The first signs of such decisions appeared subtly. Servants assigned to the baby shifted their behaviour, keeping details quiet, speaking cautiously in the mother's presence. The midwife, who once visited regularly, stopped coming. Guards posted near the nursery changed without explanation. These adjustments signalled that discussions were underway. Discussions the mother was never invited to hear. Every altered routine became a warning that the palace was recalculating. When the child no longer aligned with political plans, removal was often disguised as protection. Officials would claim the prince needed a place safer than the court. Far from unrest or conflict, they selected remote estates or monasteries where supervision was strict and communication carefully monitored. In these places, the child grew surrounded by caretakers who answered not to him or his mother but to the crown. Letters requesting updates frequently went unanswered. Gifts sent to the child never reached his hands. Silence became the new boundary, separating mother and son. Sometimes, the court changed the child's name as part of this separation. They insisted it would shield him from rivals or prevent unrest. In reality, renaming severed claims that might later challenge the succession. A boy, once recognized as the king's blood, could become, on paper, the son of a distant cousin, a ward of a noble family, or a young novice pledged to religious life. These adjustments rewrote the path of his future, with the same ease that court clerks rewrote the documents recording his birth. There were darker methods still. Records could be altered so thoroughly that the child seemed never to have existed at all. Birth entries vanished. Midwives' notes were burned, and witnesses were quietly reassigned or dismissed. When questions eventually arose, answers dissolved into vague phrases: miscarriage, illness, fate's cruelty. Where certainty once stood, only suggestion remained. A prince who lived in the arms of his mother could, through political necessity, be transformed into nothing more than a rumour. For the women who bore these children, the uncertainty became a constant ache. They woke at night with a sense of absence they could not articulate aloud. They held on to fragments of memory. A faint cry, a tiny hand, the warmth of a breathing child pressed against their chest. But these became private relics, concealed from a court that preferred them forgotten. Their grief had to be silent. Their questions had to remain unasked. Even their tears had to fall only when no one was watching. The court justified these actions with a steady calm. They argued that removing a child prevented dissent, protected the kingdom, or ensured the succession remained uncontested. Their reasoning carried the tone of duty, of responsibility, of loyalty to the crown. But beneath their polished explanations lived a simpler truth. A child without political value held no protection. His fate was negotiable, his safety conditional, his future crafted by minds unconcerned with his humanity. Over time, stories accumulated around these lost princes. Some claimed the boys were spirited away to monasteries, growing into men who never knew their own origins. Others whispered of secret burials held at dawn, attended only by those sworn to silence. A few tales spoke of young men who returned years later, bearing a resemblance to kings long dead, voicing claims no one dared confirm. Each rumour demonstrated how fragile a child's place could be in a world ruled by ambition. Those who remembered them understood the weight of that fragility. The mother, stripped of agency, lived with questions that no document could answer. Servants who once rocked the child at night carried the guilt of knowing but never speaking. Even courtiers who approved the decisions sometimes sensed, in quiet moments, that something irreversible had been done in the name of order. In the Tudor world, politics did not merely guide the realm, it rewrote the lives of its youngest souls. A prince's survival depended not on lineage alone but on timing, alliance, and the shifting temperament of those who held influence. His life could be raised, hidden, reshaped, or extinguished with a single command. And each command echoed far beyond the chamber where it was spoken. Everything here reveals how political necessity could reach into a cradle and alter destiny with unsettling ease. Yet, even as these decisions hardened into routine, murmurs within the palace suggested that certain mothers were preparing to reclaim fragments of what had been taken. Something darker is beginning to gather beneath that quiet. Carrying consequences, the court is nowhere near ready to confront. A woman in the Tudor court could wake to the sound of footsteps outside her chamber and never know whether they signaled routine duties or the collapse of her world. In those dim hours before the palace stirred, she understood how narrow the distance was between holding her child and losing him forever. Nothing in her life truly belonged to her, not even the bond forged by birth. And she moved through each day with the quiet dread of someone reminded constantly that everything could be taken without warning. Motherhood here was less a right than a temporary allowance, granted only for as long as it served political convenience. Women without official titles lived in a state of suspended breath, aware that their affection for their children was tolerated only under strict, unspoken limits. They learned to carry love in measured gestures, to soften every glance, to ensure that tenderness never appeared bold enough to threaten the court's control. In this world, even a mother's gaze could be interpreted as ambition. There were mornings when servants arrived with sealed messages, their expressions stiff and unreadable. A woman would open the wax with shaking hands, wishing for nothing more than another day beside her child. But the smallest phrase, a testamon, a shift in household arrangements, a change in guardianship, was enough to unmake her life. The king had decided the child would be raised elsewhere. The staff would be reassigned. The mother's presence was no longer required. These polished words carried the weight of a blade. She was expected to bow her head, thank the messenger, and remain composed as the child was lifted from her arms by someone chosen for loyalty rather than compassion. No protest was permitted, no grief acknowledged. The palace walls absorbed every sound until her silence became the final sign that the decision had been accepted. Women walked the corridors like muted figures, their heartbreak compressed into graceful obedience. Even those who believed themselves secure, favoured mistresses, women whose infants aligned with courtly expectations, knew that stability was an illusion crafted to keep them compliant. A moment of displeasure from the king, a rumour whispered by a rival, or a shift in alliances could sweep away everything. Once separated from their children, they were expected to resume their duties as if untouched by loss. Pain, in this world, that was not to be expressed, but folded neatly into posture and breath. The cruelty lay not only in the taking, but in the manner of it. No warning, no explanation. A woman might fall asleep with her child, breathing softly beside her, and end the day in a room that felt barren, the air strangely still. The cradle would remain, but the warmth inside it would be gone. Palace life continued with its usual rhythms. Courtiers crossing halls, officials discussing documents, servants sweeping floors, while her world hollowed out in silence. Behind closed doors, some mothers whispered prayers into sleeves damp with tears, hoping their sons would grow healthy under strangers' care rather than be crushed by palace politics. Others froze entirely, their faces pale with shock, as if guarding the last fragments of themselves from being seen. But none dared to speak openly. Questions risked accusations. Grief was interpreted as defiance. The safest posture was quiet acceptance, even when it tore at their sense of self. Even caretakers, the women who fed, carried, and soothed these royal infants, understood the precariousness of their role. They held children who were cherished by no one and coveted by many, knowing they might be ordered to relinquish them at any moment. Loyalty was measured through silence, not affection. The palace cared for obedience, not emotional truth. And obedience demanded that no one believed a child belonged to its mother. This atmosphere, heavy, controlled, merciless, taught women to brace themselves before sleep, unsure of what dawn might bring. They lived with a dread that settled into the body, stretching through the chest and tightening around the ribs, turning each breath into an exercise of endurance. Their greatest fear was not punishment or disgrace, but waking to a space where their child once slept. Everything in this moment shows how motherhood could vanish under a single royal command, leaving women with nothing but the silence forced upon them. Yet while the court believed that silence meant submission, rumours were already beginning to stir beneath that quiet surface. A shifting current of whispered stories about dangerous children is about to rise, carrying questions no one dares to answer openly. Stories drifting through the Tudor court often carried more weight than royal decrees, and among them, none were repeated more carefully than the tales of infants whose existence unsettled the balance of power. These children, born quietly in hidden chambers or behind heavy curtains, became figures of fascination long before they could walk. Their lives were fragile not only because of illness or fate, but because rumour worked like a hand at their throats, tightening whenever the court shifted its attention. A newborn prince, who should have been celebrated instead, became the centre of unease, watched as though his presence alone could unmake alliances. Whispers travelled faster than any messenger. Servants overheard hushed conversations. Midwives exchanged glances, and suddenly a dozen variations of the same rumour moved through the palace corridors. Some claimed that a prince had been poisoned before his first sleep, the milk in his cup tainted by a jealous rival. Others insisted he had been switched with another infant the night he was born, his true identity buried beneath the ambitions of a family desperate for influence. In these surroundings, truth rarely stood a chance. A single story repeated often enough began to feel real, even when no one could name its source. Mothers, whose children drew the court's suspicion, found themselves recast in roles they never chose. Without evidence, they were described as scheming courtesans, dangerous beauties, or women plotting to smuggle their sons onto the throne through deception. The palace had little interest in protecting them from such accusations. In fact, rumour served the court well. Blame was easier to place when stories painted these women as villains. Once a reputation hardened, even innocence looked like performance. Their gestures appeared calculated, their silence manipulative, their grief insincere. Rumour turned them into shadows of themselves. For the court, a child of uncertain lineage posed a greater threat than any foreign army. His existence alone challenged the neat lines of inheritance on which so much power depended. If he belonged to the king, he represented potential chaos. If he did not, he still represented danger, because someone might claim he did. The court responded to this fear with secrecy. Cradles were moved in the night. Names were altered. Records vanished. Those who handled the infants were instructed never to speak of them outside designated rooms. Any slip of the tongue could cost a life. Some children, too young to understand the danger surrounding them, were removed from the palace entirely. They were sent to distant households under false identities, raised by families sworn to silence. Their mothers often never learned where they had gone. They only knew that their child still lived in the world, though not in reach. Others were placed in monasteries, their futures sealed before they had a chance to choose them. A few simply disappeared, leaving behind no explanation, only the echo of a lullaby remembered by no one. The most unsettling part was how easily these stories blended into daily life. Courtiers repeated them at meals. Servants repeated them in the laundry halls. And over time, rumour became a form of entertainment wrapped in fear. No one questioned why so many similar tales existed. No one asked why documents were missing, or why certain chambers were suddenly closed. Stories filled the gaps where truth had been removed. And the palace learned to accept these stories as part of its structure. These whispers shaped reputations long after the individuals involved were gone. A mother who had loved her child fiercely might be remembered as treacherous. A prince who had never taken a breath might be described as a political threat. Rumour rewrote what history struggled to preserve. The palace preferred it this way. Stories could be controlled more easily than facts. By the time official chronicles were written, the truth was already buried beneath layers of fear, ambition, and convenience. For those who lived through these moments, the uncertainty was suffocating. Mothers feared every knock at their door. Servants avoided eye contact when carrying newborns. Courtiers paused before asking questions. Unsure whether curiosity would mark them as disloyal, the entire palace existed in a state of tense anticipation, as though waiting for a secret to explode. Every action felt like a gesture toward or away from catastrophe. History eventually recorded these tales not as confirmed events, but as possibilities. Possibilities powerful enough to shape behavior, influence decisions, and destroy lives. Even centuries later, the silence surrounding these children has not fully lifted. Archives remain incomplete. Accounts contradict one another. What remains are fragments, hints of danger, brief mentions of unnamed infants, descriptions of mothers whose reputations darkened without cause. Everything surrounding these stories shows how swiftly rumour could reshape the fate of both mother and child in the Tudor world. Yet beneath these whispered legends, new fears were already forming around the emotional toll. Such suspicion placed on women struggling to appear calm. A quiet unravelling is beginning to surface, pulling us toward the inner world each mother was forced to hide. Life for a mother in the Tudor court unfolded beneath a constant pressure that demanded silence, grace, and unwavering composure. Every morning began with the same quiet ritual, arranging the face into something calm, steadying the breath, suppressing whatever emotion had risen in the night. She knew that even the slightest tremor, an anxious glance, a tightened jaw, a sigh held too long, could be read as defiance. In this world, women learned to perform a version of themselves that pleased the palace more than the truth ever could. Gratitude was expected of them, even when fear tightened their chest. They were told to show loyalty, even when that loyalty had cost them everything. They were expected to bow with serene dignity, while their children were raised by others. To the court, an obedient appearance mattered more than the raw, aching reality of motherhood. What happened inside a woman, what she felt, feared, or mourned, was irrelevant. Only the mask she wore was allowed to exist. Before their own children, the performance deepened. A mother could not cling too tightly or smile too warmly. Displays of affection were to be controlled, measured, and carefully timed. Excessive tenderness was suspicious. It suggested ambition or desperation. Too little warmth, however, was interpreted as coldness or guilt. Every gesture had to balance on an invisible line, one that shifted without warning. Even holding a child became an exercise in restraint. The court watched how long her arms lingered around him, how her eyes softened, and whether her voice trembled. She learned to bury her love beneath meticulous discipline. In private, these women unravelled in silence. Tears were wiped away quickly, as though even the walls might report them. Some paced their chambers at night, unable to breathe under the weight of their own vigilance. Others sat completely still, hands folded, minds racing with dread over what tomorrow might demand. The The constant awareness that they could lose their child, or be accused of wanting too much, gnawed at them relentlessly. It was not a fear that struck suddenly, but one that lived inside them, growing sharper each day. The body reacted to this strain long before the mind admitted it. Shoulders stiffened. Sleep thinned into restless fragments. Appetite disappeared. A glance toward the door could trigger a tightening in the chest. The reflexive terror that someone might enter with news that would dismantle their world. Even moments of quiet felt dangerous, as if peace itself was a warning that something was about to shift. Living in such tension turned ordinary gestures. Holding a cup, smoothing a sleeve, nodding to a servant, into small acts of control. Those around them contributed to the pressure. Courtiers watched with predatory interest. Rivals noted every sign of discomfort. Even attendants, trained to silence, could not hide the glances that revealed what they suspected. A woman in this environment was never simply herself. She was a symbol, a pawn, a threat, a story waiting to be twisted. Her posture, her tone, her behavior, all were interpreted through layers of expectation and fear. The palace had a way of reducing women to roles they never volunteered to play. Rumor intensified the strain. A mother who appeared anxious was said to be hiding something. A mother who appeared calm was said to be plotting. A mother who appeared too loving was said to have dangerous intentions. There was no safe expression, no safe version of herself she could present. Every path led to scrutinizing eyes, quietly judging. This uncertainty carved itself into her thoughts until self-doubt became constant, as familiar as breathing. Even their children sensed the tension. Though too young to grasp politics, they reacted to the stiffness in their mother's arms, the hesitation in their touch, the way their eyes flicked to the door before every embrace. Children learned from these moments that love in the palace came wrapped in caution. Their mothers wished to offer comfort, but fear sat between them like a third presence. Unspoken, unwelcome, undeniable. Over time, the performance became second nature. A woman could stand in a crowded hall, appearing serene, while internally she fought the instinct to shield her child from every gaze. She adapted to the palace's demands because survival required it, but the cost was immense. She lost parts of herself, spontaneity, joy, and openness, until she moved through her days like someone walking in a narrow corridor, unable to turn or breathe freely. History rarely acknowledges this psychological landscape. Chronicles record alliances, deaths, scandals, births, but not the strained smile of a mother pretending she feels safe. Not the night she sat awake fearing a sound in the hallway. Not the way she rehearsed her expressions before stepping into the light. Yet these quiet battles shaped her life more profoundly than any decree. Everything here reveals how performance became a shield for women who had no other defense in the Tudor court. Yet beneath that, practiced calm. The consequences of such constant restraint were already shaping the children who grew beside them. Some quiet undercurrent is now forming around those young lives, hinting at secrets they never meant to carry. Children born into the Tudor court, under uncertain circumstances, entered a world that refused to acknowledge them fully, yet refused to let them out of its sight. They grew up in a strange half-light, present but unspoken, watched but rarely claimed. Their names seldom appeared in official records, and when they did, the references were brief, vague, or buried beneath layers of polite phrasing. The absence of detail became part of their identity. Silence shaped them long before they understood why it surrounded them. From an early age, these boys sensed there was something unusual about the way adults behaved around them. Servants softened their voices, avoided answering certain questions, and glanced toward the door before speaking. Tutors treated them with a mixture of caution and distance, offering lessons without ever explaining where the boy belonged in the hierarchy that ruled the palace. Even nurses, who spent the most time with them, maintained a guarded warmth, as though loving the child too openly might be seen as loyalty to the wrong person. As they grew older, the lack of clarity became more intrusive. Their daily lives were monitored with precision. Meals, lessons, prayers, and recreations, everything recorded by those assigned to watch them. The boys were not told what danger justified such supervision, but they felt the tension in the air whenever they entered a room. Conversations stopped abruptly. Smiles appeared too quickly. Adults performed calmness with the same careful gestures their mothers once perfected. The children learned to read the smallest shifts in expression, knowing they offered clues no one dared articulate. The uncertainty that shaped their world seeped into their understanding of themselves. They did not know whether to consider themselves privileged or precarious. They were dressed well, fed well, and educated meticulously. Yet none of these comforts came with explanations. They inhabited spaces that looked safe but felt unstable. Rumor clung to them like a shadow, too vague to grasp, too persistent to ignore. Some learned not to ask questions. Others learned to ask them quietly, testing whether the truth was something adults would allow. When these boys approached adolescence, the court's unease intensified. Their faces began to resemble men whose names were spoken carefully. Their presence evoked possibilities the court preferred not to confront. It was at this stage that futures were decided for them, though never by them. Some were sent to monasteries, where silence became a permanent condition rather than an atmosphere. Cloisters offered both sanctuary and containment, a place where a dangerous lineage could be hidden beneath the safety of devotional life. The boys were told this path honored them, though they understood it as a cage built of prayer and obedience. Others vanished more abruptly. They were escorted from the palace under the pretense of relocation, only for their trail to end within weeks. Official accounts described these departures as routine, sometimes even voluntary, but the absence of detail spoke louder than any explanation. Those who remained in the palace learned not to mention their missing companions. Discretion was expected. Forgetting was safer than remembering. In time, the vanished boys became folded into the court's unspoken history. Whispers without confirmation. Stories without endings. For those who stayed, adulthood brought little clarity. They occupied carefully managed positions, assistants in noble households, attendants in royal service, or minor clerks whose names appeared rarely in documents. They were close enough to power to be useful, yet too ambiguous to be trusted. Suspicion followed them into every chamber. Their behavior was observed, their alliances monitored, their ambitions discouraged. Some accepted this half-life out of resignation. Others carried their confusion like a concealed wound. Yet the emotional toll was undeniable. Growing up under constant surveillance altered the rhythm of their thoughts. They became cautious in their speech, selective in their friendships, and patient with uncertainty. They learned to mirror the court's quietness even when their hearts strained for answers. Their childhoods, shaped by secrecy, left marks invisible to the chroniclers who later wrote the polished versions of Tudor history. Even the few who managed to forge stable lives did so while navigating a past no one would explain. Their identities consisted of fragments, a resemblance someone commented on too boldly, a rumor overheard in a hallway, a document they were not meant to see. They lived between what was spoken and what was withheld. For some, this tension hardened into discipline. For others, it hardened into sorrow. What remained consistent was the silence around them, an institutional refusal to acknowledge their full existence. The palace understood that certain truths could destabilize everything it relied upon, and so the children grew into men without ever knowing whether they were heirs. Threats, mistakes, or simply inconvenient reminders of choices the court wished to forget. Everything unfolding through these children's lives shows how deeply silence could shape a destiny in the Tudor world. Yet, as these boys matured into adults molded by secrecy, another question began to rise about the mothers who once held them. Certain buried stories are drifting back toward the surface now, carrying the weight of lives the court chose not to remember. Women who gave birth to princes within the Tudor court often passed through history like faint traces of breath on cold glass, visible for a moment, then gone without explanation. Their names were rarely written into official genealogies, as though their presence disrupted the clean lines that chroniclers wished to preserve. They were essential, yet disposable. Central, yet erased. Even when their children shaped political decisions, their own existence remained peripheral, a detail the palace preferred not to acknowledge. They lived and suffered in rooms filled with whispers, and when they vanished, the silence left behind felt intentional. These women entered the palace through narrow, unsteady paths, some as attendants, some as companions, others as quiet figures who caught the king's attention in a single, unguarded moment. The court treated them as temporary fixtures, valued only when they carried a child that might influence succession. Once the child was taken away, placed with noble households, nurses, or tutors, the mothers were left with empty arms and an even emptier place in the eyes of the palace. Their usefulness had reached its end. For many, the disappearance began subtly. Invitations to meals grew less frequent. Doors that once opened easily became guarded. Servants who had spoken warmly now bowed with distant politeness. They were not dismissed outright. Dismissal would have acknowledged they mattered. Instead, they were absorbed into the background, expected to fade without protest. The court excelled at this form of erasure. Slow, quiet, calculated. Their stories were complicated by the fact that they were not permitted to tell them. Letters were monitored, conversations overheard, movements controlled. A mother who attempted to learn how her child was faring risked accusations of ambition. A woman who lingered near nursery corridors risked suspicion. The safest course was to withdraw, to accept invisibility as protection. In time, even speaking the child's name aloud became an act of courage. Some were married off to minor nobles or distant retainers under the guise of generosity. The court framed these arrangements as opportunities for a respectable life beyond the palace walls. But the truth was harsher. Marriage served to relocate them, to remove them from proximity to the child they had borne. They might be settled in quiet countryside estates, expected to adapt to domestic routines while carrying a grief no one addresses. Their new husbands often knew the circumstances of their arrival and treated them with caution, curiosity, or resentment. Others simply disappeared from records altogether. A departure notice, a brief remark in an official ledger, or nothing at all. They walked out of the palace carrying only the knowledge of what they had lost. Their identities became fragments, whispers among servants, hints in the margins of documents, the echo of a rumor preserved in a letter. Chroniclers of the time wrote extensively about kings, battles, treaties, and courtly intrigues, but seldom about the women who bore children central to those stories. Yet these mothers lived full, complex lives beyond the silence imposed on them. They carried the memory of holding their infants for too short a time. They remembered the weight of small hands, the scent of warm skin, the brief glow of hope that motherhood offered before it was taken away. These memories persisted long after the world forgot them. In quiet rooms far from the palace, they might pause at the sound of a child's laughter, wondering whether their own sons were still alive, whether they grew into men, whether they ever thought of the mother they never truly knew. For some women, the only way to navigate the weight of absence was to build a different life entirely. They tended gardens, managed households, stitched linens, and prayed in chapels. Their days unfolded in steadier rhythms than the palace had ever allowed. Yet even in moments of peace, the shadow of what they had endured remained. They had once stood at the edge of power, close enough to feel its heat, close enough to be burned. Their departure was not liberation but exile. History's neglect compounded their loss. Without names recorded in official texts, they became invisible to the generations that followed. Their existence survived only through implication, the birth of a child, the sudden appearance of a young prince in the royal nursery, the disappearance of a woman from court life. Even modern scholars struggle to reconstruct their identities. What remains are silhouettes. Women defined not by their lives, but by the voids the palace left where their stories should have been. This erasure did not stem from accident, but design. Acknowledging these mothers would mean acknowledging the instability of royal lineage, the secrecy surrounding illegitimate births, and the cruelty of separating women from their children. The court preferred cleaner narratives, ones that protected authority from scrutiny, so the mothers were removed from view, and their silence was folded into the structure of Tudor memory. Yet even now, traces of them persist in letters, rumours, and contradictions in the historical record. Their absence speaks loudly. The gaps themselves reveal the truth, that these women endured, suffered, and carried love in circumstances designed to erase them. Everything here reveals how thoroughly the Tudor world concealed the women who bore its most vulnerable heirs. Yet beneath that long silence, a final truth waits in the shadow of these forgotten lives, one that leads us toward the high cost of bearing a son in a court that consumed those who touched its power. This lingering weight is now guiding us toward the last revelation still kept in darkness. There is a certain stillness that settles over the Tudor court when the story reaches its final edge, as if the walls themselves understand the weight of what has unfolded. Women who once believed that bearing a son would lift them into safety soon learned that this small, fragile life could expose them more deeply than any ambition ever could. Their pride became a signal, their joy a target, their devotion an instrument through which others measured power. What appeared to be privilege revealed itself as something sharpened, something that cut both ways with quiet precision. The court always looked at these mothers with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. They were honoured publicly, praised for giving the realm a potential heir. Yet privately their steps were followed with a scrutiny that never relented. A single misinterpreted glance, a single word spoken too boldly, could shift them from being cherished to being watched. Their children, instead of anchoring them, became the very reason their positions trembled. Pride, in this world, was not a celebration, but a reminder that nothing was guaranteed. Those who brushed against royal power quickly discovered how consuming it could be. At first, the attention felt flattering. Servants bowed lower. Courtiers offered careful smiles. Officials addressed them with courtesy they had never known before. They stood closer to influence than any woman of their station had reason to expect. But the court had a way of drawing people in only to let them fall. Behind every polite gesture hid calculations. Behind every soft voice hid the knowledge that alliances shifted like dust underfoot. Some mothers were able to protect themselves for a time through restraint, through stillness, through understanding when to speak and when to remain silent. Others tried to assert themselves, believing that motherhood gave them a measure of authority. But the court did not permit such confidence. Any attempt to claim space was interpreted as overreach. Any visible hope for the future of their sons was treated as a threat. They learned to stand quietly, to breathe carefully, to walk with lowered eyes, even when the child they carried came from the highest man in the kingdom. For those who lost their children to illness, decree, or political necessity, the sorrow did not fade easily. They had carried life under their ribs, endured the uncertainty of birth, and endured the fear that followed. Losing the child meant losing not only love, but also the fragile thread that tied them to relevance. The court allowed them to grieve only in private. Publicly, They were expected to behave with composure, to acknowledge that such losses were simply part of palace life. No allowances were made for the depth of a mother's pain. The women who survived long enough to witness their sons grow found themselves facing a different kind of fear. A boy becoming a young man drew attention that brought new danger. Rivals questioned his legitimacy. Advisors whispered about the stability of the realm. Each year that passed tightened the tension between mother and child. What should have been pride became something like foreboding. She saw only risk in her son's posture, in his curiosity, in the way he was beginning to resemble the king who had fathered him. Some mothers were removed from their sons' lives under the pretext of ensuring proper education or noble supervision. Others remained nearby but were discouraged from exerting influence. They were told this was for the child's own good, that discipline and structure were necessary. But beneath those explanations lay a truth everyone understood. The court did not want the child to remember who had carried him, who had first held him, who had whispered to him in the quiet hours of the night. The palace insisted that lineage mattered more than love. History is silent about many of these mothers, not because they lacked importance, but because having their names written down would have complicated the narrative the court wished to present. Royal succession required clarity. These women represented uncertainty. Their stories were brushed aside, reduced to footnotes, or erased. Chroniclers wrote about kings and heirs with confidence. Yet the women who brought those heirs into the world slipped away like figures in a fading tapestry. Still, their presence lingers in the faint contradictions found in private letters, in the small gaps between official accounts, in the unspoken explanations behind sudden changes in household arrangements. Their lives may have been removed from the foreground, but the marks they left remain embedded in the structure of Tudor politics. Every quiet alliance, every reshaped succession plan, every orphaned rumour has its roots in the experiences of women who bore children into a world that could not afford to remember them. The paradox of their existence defines the entire story. To bear a son was to touch the highest point of influence available to someone of their position. Yet that same moment of elevation also exposed them to the greatest vulnerability. Their pride illuminated them briefly, and that illumination drew the gaze of those who wished to diminish them. Power in the Tudor court moved with a cold, steady rhythm, and these women, no matter how devoted, no matter how loyal, were caught in its path. When they left the palace, some carried small tokens that reminded them of the child they had lost. A piece of cloth, a carved toy, a ribbon once tied around an infant's wrist. Others carried nothing at all, but each carried the same weight. The knowledge that love had not been protection, that motherhood had not been sanctuary, and that being chosen had cost more than being forgotten ever would. They stepped into the world beyond the palace doors, with the quiet grace of people who understood they were walking away from a part of themselves that would never return. The story of these women reveals the final truth at the heart of the Tudor court. No privilege existed without danger. No joy existed without consequence. And no connection to power existed without cost. Bearing a son could open doors, but those doors often led to rooms where safety was temporary, and affection had to be hidden. Their experiences remind us that history's grandeur was built on the fragile endurance of those who received none of its credit. As the narrative closes, their presence remains steady, lingering at the edge of the historical record like a faint echo. They are not entirely gone. They exist in the spaces left unwritten, in the questions that cannot be answered, and in the realization that behind every prince stood a woman whose life the court preferred not to name. Their stories may not be fully preserved, but the truth of their suffering and resilience continues to shape how we understand the world they inhabited. And so, in this final quiet moment, the echoes of their lives settle into stillness, unrecorded, uncelebrated, but deeply felt, reminding us that the most dangerous privilege of all was simply loving a child in a place where love could be used against you. Thank you for staying through this long shadowed journey. May your night be gentle. May your rest be deep. And may sleep come to you like a steady tide, carrying the weight of these forgotten lives into silence. Good night.